A world where death wasn't the end. It was a journey, guided by a jackal-headed guardian, judged by the weight of your heart, and shaped by spells whispered by a goddess of impossible power. This was Egypt, a civilization where the gods didn't live far above the clouds. They walked beside people, shaped their destinies, and controlled every breath of wind, every flood of the Nile, and every flicker of magic. In this world, Ra fought to keep darkness at bay, Osiris ruled over the silent kingdom of the dead, Isis wove spells strong enough to resurrect a god, and Set, god of storms and chaos, threatened everything they stood for. These weren't just gods. They were forces of life, death, and magic, eternal, powerful, and deeply human in their emotions and conflicts. And today, we're diving into the Pantheon that shaped one of the greatest civilizations in history. From the creation of the world to the battles that defined it, this is the story of the Egyptian Pantheon, gods of life, death, and magic. Stay with me, because the deeper you go, the more you'll see how these ancient gods still echo through our stories, our symbols, and even the way we understand life and death today. To understand the Egyptian gods, we first need to understand the world they were born from. A world shaped by desert, death, and the endless rhythm of the Nile. Unlike the gods of Greece or Rome, who lived far away on mountaintops, the Egyptian gods were woven into the fabric of daily life. They weren't just figures in myths. They were forces guiding the sun, guarding the dead, protecting children, healing sickness, controlling storms, and even deciding whether your crops would grow or wither. To Egyptians, life wasn't a straight line. It was a cycle: birth, death, rebirth. Just like the Nile flooded every year, bringing new life to the land, humans too were reborn in the afterlife. This worldview created gods who didn't simply rule nature, they embodied it. Ra wasn't just the sun god, he was the sun. Osiris wasn't just lord of the dead, he was the cycle of dying and rising. Isis wasn't just a sorceress, she was the power of protection itself. Every aspect of existence had a divine heartbeat behind it. At the core of Egyptian belief was Ma'a, the cosmic principle of harmony, truth, and balance. Ma'a wasn't just a goddess, she was the very structure of reality. To live in Ma'a meant everything was in order. The river flowed correctly, the seasons came on time, justice prevailed, and society stayed stable. The gods existed to protect Ma'a, and chaos, called Isfet, was constantly trying to destroy it. This eternal tug of war shaped all Egyptian myths: Ra versus Apophis, Horus versus Set, order versus disorder. For Egyptians, the universe wasn't guaranteed. It had to be protected every single day. Egypt didn't have just one all-powerful god handling everything. They had hundreds, each responsible for a specific part of life. One god guarded childbirth, another controlled knowledge and writing, another healed snake bites, another protected doors and thresholds. Even beer had its own goddess. This reflected Egyptian society: highly specialized, organized, structured, a civilization built on precision. The gods worked the same way, a divine network where each being had a unique job. And yes, a few gods overlapped or merged. Some had multiple forms, different names in different cities, or transformed over time. Egyptian religion was fluid, layered, and deeply symbolic. To Egyptians, the Nile wasn't just a river. It was life. Every year, the river flooded its banks, leaving rich black soil behind. This miracle, reliable, powerful, and life-giving, shaped their belief in renewal and rebirth. The Nile divided the land into Kemet, the fertile black land, and Ashret, the red desert, realm of chaos. This duality became part of their pantheon: fertility gods versus desert gods, life versus death, order versus chaos. Set, god of the desert, was feared because he represented the unpredictable, the hostile, the unknown. Yet his power was necessary to balance the world. Everything was connected. Even though they controlled cosmic forces, Egyptian gods had emotions, rivalries, families, and flaws. Ra grew old and needed protection. Osiris was betrayed and dismembered. Isis searched for her husband, driven by devotion and grief. Set felt jealousy, rage, and ambition. Horus struggled to prove himself worthy of the throne. Their stories mirrored human struggles, just told on a cosmic scale. This made them relatable, memorable, and deeply loved by Egyptians. People prayed to gods not as distant masters, but as companions who understood the struggles of life. Unlike many other mythologies, Egyptians believed their gods weren't far away. They could inhabit statues, appear in dreams, send signs through animals, or manifest through priests during rituals. Temples weren't places for ordinary worship. They were homes for the gods. Priests bathed, dressed, and fed the statues every morning because Egyptians believed a god literally resided within. To the people of Egypt, the gods were present, not symbolic. And so, from the Nile to the desert, from the sunrise to the tomb, every corner of Egyptian life was shaped by gods unlike any others. Gods born from a world where balance was sacred, death was a journey, and magic was the very language of creation. Now that the stage is set, let's step into the beginning of everything, the creation of the Egyptian universe and the first gods who shaped it. Before there were pyramids, before the Nile carved its path through the desert, before even the first pharaoh ever wore a crown, Egyptians believed there was nothing. Not darkness, not space, not time, just an endless, silent ocean of potential called Nun, the great primordial waters from which all existence would someday rise. From this infinite sea, a single force emerged, Atum, the self-created one. He had no parents, no beginning, and no form beyond pure will. To the Egyptians, Atum was the moment the universe woke up. They imagined him standing alone on the first mound of earth, a tiny island rising out of the vast waters, lit only by the potential of creation itself. Atum's loneliness became the source of everything that followed. From himself, he brought forth the first pair of gods. Shu, god of air. Tefnut, goddess of moisture. They were the first breath, the first drop, the first separation of chaos into meaning. This wasn't just a myth, it was the Egyptian explanation for how order began emerging from the formless. Shu and Tefnut journeyed into the darkness to shape the early universe. But when they did not return for a long time, Atum grew worried. So he sent out his eye, often depicted as a fiery, divine force. Sometimes like a sun, sometimes like a goddess, to search for them. When Atum was finally reunited with his children, he wept tears of joy. And from those tears, humanity was born. This is one of the most poetic ideas in Egyptian mythology, that humans were literally created from divine emotion. Shu and Tefnut then gave birth to the next generation, Geb, the earth god, Nut, the sky goddess. But unlike many mythologies where the sky is male and the earth is female, the Egyptians imagined it the other way around. Nut arched overhead, her body shimmering with stars, while Geb lay beneath her, covered in mountains, valleys, and fertile soil. They loved each other intensely, so tightly intertwined that there was no space between them, no room for creation to grow. So Shu, their father, lifted the sky from the earth, separating Nut from Geb, creating the world's first structure, the space in which life could unfold. This act of separation symbolized the beginning of time, season, and order. From the union of Geb and Nut came four gods who would shape the destiny of Egypt. Osiris, destined to rule. Isis, the most powerful sorceress. Set, the embodiment of chaos and storms. Nephthys, guardian of the night and the unseen. This divine quartet formed the foundation of countless Egyptian stories: love, betrayal, resurrection, justice, and the eternal struggle between order and chaos. Osiris and Isis would become symbols of life and magic. Set would become the unpredictable, the dangerous, the necessary force of disorder. Nephthys would become the silent comforter of the dead. Their relationships, rivalries, and destinies would define Egyptian spirituality for millennia. Every step in this creation myth reflected something Egyptians saw in their world. The rising mound of Atum echoed how the Nile left patches of earth after each flood. The separation of Nut and Geb mirrored the horizon, the eternal meeting of sky and land. The cycles of birth and separation symbolized the agricultural seasons. The rivalry among the gods explained the balance of order and chaos in daily life. To the Egyptians, mythology wasn't just storytelling, it was a map of the universe. A guide to understanding nature. A way to explain why the sun rises, why the river floods, why storms rage, and why humans must live in balance with everything around them. From Atum's first breath to the birth of the divine family, Egyptians saw the universe as a living, interconnected cycle of creation and rebirth. And now that the world had form, sky above, earth below, air in between, and gods to govern each force, the stage was set for the rise of the Pantheon we know today. The sun god Ra would take his place in the sky, Osiris would become king, Set would bring chaos, Isis would wield magic beyond imagination, and humanity, born from a god's tears, would begin its journey under the watchful eyes of these ancient beings. To the ancient Egyptians, life was not an accident. It wasn't something that simply happened. It was something guided, protected, and illuminated by gods whose very existence shaped the world. These were the deities who brought warmth, growth, joy, order, and creation into human lives. Some ruled the heavens, some crafted the world with their minds, and some nurtured the emotional heart of the Egyptian people. Let's step into their stories. Before anything else, Egyptians looked up. Every morning, the sun rose over the horizon, a burst of light after the long, dangerous night. To them, this wasn't just astronomy, it was Ra, the mighty sun god, beginning his daily voyage. Ra's daily journey. Egyptians believed Ra sailed across the sky in a golden solar bark. At noon, he was at his strongest, blazing with authority. But when night fell, the journey turned perilous. Ra descended into the underworld, traveling through 12 gates representing each hour of the night. There, he faced Apophis, a massive serpent of chaos who attempted to swallow the sun and plunge existence into darkness. But Ra always triumphed. With every dawn, he was reborn, a symbolic reminder that light always returns and order always conquers chaos. Ra and the Pharaoh. Every pharaoh was considered the son of Ra, chosen to maintain Ma'at, the balance of the universe. Ra wasn't just a god, he was political power, national unity, and cosmic order. Ra's many forms. Over time, Ra combined with other gods. Amun-Ra, the hidden one turned supreme creator. Ra-Harakti, the rising sun fused with Horus. Khepri, the scarab beetle symbolizing rebirth. Each form represented a different aspect of the sun's eternal cycle. If Ra was the light of the world, Hathor was the warmth within it. She was the goddess of beauty, music, dance, motherhood, and joy, the embodiment of everything that made life worth living. The mother of all, Hathor was often called the mother of mothers. Women prayed to her for fertility, safe childbirth, and protection for their families. Her temples rang with music, drums, and sistrums, instruments believed to please her spirit. The gentle goddess with a hidden fury. But Hathor had a powerful dual nature. In one myth, Ra sent her to punish humanity for defying him. She transformed into Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of war and destruction. Her fury was so terrifying that Ra had to stop her by tricking her with red beer that resembled blood. As she drank it, Sekhmet became calm again, returning to her gentle, loving form as Hathor. This story symbolized the delicate balance between joy and wrath, and the belief that divine love could become divine destruction when pushed too far. While Ra brought light and Hathor brought joy, Ptah brought intention, craft, and creation through thought. He was the patron of artisans, builders, sculptors, architects, the divine mind behind every masterpiece in Egypt. Creation through thought and speech. One of the most profound Egyptian beliefs is that Ptah created the world not with hands, but through his mind and his words. In the Memphite theology, Ptah conceived every object in existence in his heart, the seat of the mind in Egyptian belief, and brought it into reality by speaking its name aloud. This made Ptah one of the most philosophical gods, a deity of intellect, creativity, and innovation. Ptah and the Great Monuments. Egyptians believed that builders, craftsmen, and sculptors were guided by Ptah's spirit. Every temple, every statue, every sarcophagus carried his blessing. He wasn't a distant creator. He was active, present, his energy woven into every stone of the ancient world. These three gods, Ra, Hathor, and Ptah, reflected the essence of Egyptian life. Ra gave light and order. Hathor gave joy, compassion, and human connection. Ptah gave creativity, structure, and the power to shape the world. Together, they formed the foundation of a civilization that valued harmony, art, beauty, and cosmic balance. Life, to the Egyptians, wasn't random. It was something crafted, guided, and watched over by powerful forces who cared for the world in ways both grand and intimate. But if life required the protection of the gods, death required something even greater. guidance. Because for the Egyptians, death wasn't an ending. It was a passage into a world ruled by gods whose power shaped destiny itself. And so, in the next chapter, we step into the realm of the afterlife, where Osiris rules, Anubis judges, and Ma'at decides the fate of your soul. To the ancient Egyptians, death was never a full stop. It was a transition, a journey, a trial. A passage from the world of sunlight into a realm of shadows, gods, challenges, and judgment. And ruling over this vast unseen world were the most feared, yet most revered, gods of the Egyptian Pantheon. Let's descend into their domain. Long before he ruled the afterlife, Osiris was a king on earth, a wise ruler who brought agriculture, laws, and civilization to humanity. But his reign sparked jealousy in his brother Set, the god of storms and chaos. The betrayal. Set crafted a beautiful chest, carved to the exact size of Osiris. At a grand feast, Set challenged the guests. Whoever fits perfectly inside this chest may have it. Osiris stepped inside, and Set slammed the lid shut. He sealed it with molten lead and cast it into the Nile. The first death. With this act, Osiris became the first being to die. His murder marked the beginning of death itself. But his story didn't end there. Resurrection and kingship of the underworld. Isis, Osiris's devoted wife, searched for his body, reassembled his scattered remains, and with powerful magic, brought him back to life. Not to rule among the living, but to rule the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Osiris became the eternal king of the dead, a symbol of resurrection, renewal, and hope. For Egyptians, Osiris was not a god of doom. He was the promise that death can be overcome. Before Osiris ruled the dead, the underworld belonged to Anubis, the jackal-headed god with calm eyes and an unshakable sense of duty. Why a jackal? Jackals roamed the desert near tombs. Their presence shaped the image of Anubis, a divine protector who guarded the resting places of the dead from animals, tomb robbers, and forces of chaos. The god of mummification, Anubis was said to have embalmed Osiris himself, inventing the process of mummification. Every priest who wrapped a body invoked his name. He guided the hands of embalmers, ensuring the body remained intact so the soul could recognize it in the afterlife. Guide through the Duat, Anubis then escorted souls through the labyrinth of the underworld toward the most important moment of all. The weighing of the heart. If there was one force Egyptians feared more than death, it was judgment. At the center of this judgment stood Ma'at, the goddess of truth, balance, morality, and universal order. Her symbol was a single feather, the weighing of the heart ritual. Once a soul reached the Hall of Two Truths, Anubis placed their heart on a golden scale. On the opposite side lay the feather of Ma'at. The heart, believed to hold one's conscience, must be lighter or equal in weight to the feather. If it was heavy with wrongdoing, lies, selfishness, or disorder, doom awaited. If it was light, pure, and balanced with Ma'at, eternal life awaited. Waiting beside the scale sat a terrifying creature, Ammit. Part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, the three most dangerous animals in Egypt. Ammit was known as the Eater of Hearts. She was not evil. She was simply the enforcer of cosmic balance. If your heart failed the test, Ammit devoured it, and your soul was erased forever. Not tortured, not burned, simply ceased to exist. To the Egyptians, this was the ultimate fear, not eternal punishment, but obliteration. As the gods carried out judgment, one deity recorded every detail with perfect clarity. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing, and divine knowledge. The recorder of destiny, Thoth stood beside the scales with his palette and reed pen, documenting the fate of every soul. No bribe could sway him. No lie could deceive him. He was the cosmic secretary of truth, ensuring that the outcome was just, honest, and aligned with Ma'at. The journey through the afterlife was not simple. The Duat was filled with gates, guardians, rivers of fire, serpent gods, lakes of darkness, and trials that tested the soul's virtue. The Book of the Dead, a collection of spells, served as a guide for these challenges. Egyptians buried the dead with these texts so they could navigate the underworld safely and reach Osiris's realm in peace. If the soul passed judgment, it entered the field of reeds, a perfect mirror of life on earth, but without suffering, hunger, sickness, or death. Imagine endless fields of golden crops, cool breezes from the Nile, and families reunited forever. Here, the blessed dead farmed, feasted, fished, and lived in eternal harmony. Life continued, but perfected. For the Egyptians, death wasn't something to fear. It was simply a new chapter, overseen by gods who valued justice, protection, and balance. But the afterlife wasn't the end of divine power. Beyond life and death lay another force, mysterious, powerful, and woven into every ritual and every prayer. Magic. And in the next chapter, we meet the gods who ruled that unseen force and shaped the myths of Egypt through spells, knowledge, and transformation. If the gods of creation built the world, and the gods of death governed the journey beyond it, then the gods of magic and protection were the invisible shield that held everything together. In ancient Egypt, Heka, the power of magic, wasn't just superstition. It was believed to be a fundamental force of the universe, a divine energy that existed even before the gods themselves. And through this sacred energy, deities of magic and protection guarded humanity, guided kings, and battled unseen threats lurking in the shadows. Before diving into the more famous protective deities, we must start with Heka, the very embodiment of magic. To the Egyptians, Heka wasn't a magician, he was magic itself. He existed at the dawn of creation, standing beside the primeval waters, infusing the cosmos with life-giving power. Priests invoked him in healing rituals, amulets were empowered through him, and even the other gods relied on his force to carry out their divine roles. Without Heka, the universe would simply collapse, stripped of meaning, energy, and order. He was the silent architect of miracles, the cosmic engine behind every spell, every prayer, every heartbeat. Among Egypt's pantheon, no deity wielded magic with more mastery or devotion than Isis. She wasn't just a goddess, she was the goddess revered for thousands of years as the ultimate protector, healer, and divine mother. Her magic was said to be so powerful that she once tricked Ra himself into revealing his secret name, gaining knowledge that made her the most potent sorceress in the cosmos. But Isis didn't use her power for domination. Her magic was rooted in love and devotion, especially toward her husband Osiris and her son Horus. After Osiris was murdered and dismembered by Set, it was Isis who searched the land for his scattered body parts, used forbidden spells to reassemble him, and breathed life into him long enough to conceive Horus. Through this act, she became the symbol of resurrection, healing, and unwavering protection. Her wings, often spread wide in Egyptian art, were not just decorative. They represented the protective embrace she offered to kings, children, and even the souls of the dead as they crossed into the afterlife. At first glance, Bastet seems soft, the goddess of cats, home, fertility, and feminine grace. But beneath that gentle exterior lies a fierce protector, one who could shift from a loving guardian to a deadly warrior in an instant. In Egyptian households, Bastet was the invisible shield against evil spirits, disease, and misfortune. Cats were sacred to her, believed to carry her spirit and bless the homes they lived in. Killing a cat, even accidentally, was considered a terrible crime. But there was another side of Bastet. When danger threatened Egypt, when chaos rose, or war was imminent, Bastet transformed into her lioness aspect, similar to her sister Sekhmet. In this state she was unstoppable, a divine predator unleashed to tear apart the enemies of the gods and the people. Bastet represents a truth Egyptians deeply believed. Protection is not only gentle, sometimes it must be fierce. While not usually categorized solely as a protector, Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing and wisdom, played a critical role in the world of divine magic. Thoth was the scribe of the gods, the keeper of every spell ever spoken, every ritual ever performed. His knowledge was limitless. He knew the secret languages of animals, the movements of the stars, and the words that could bend reality. He was the stabilizer of cosmic order, stepping in during moments of imbalance. When Isis needed spells to restore Osiris, Thoth guided her. When the gods quarreled, Thoth mediated. When the universe risked tipping into chaos, Thoth recalibrated reality. His magic was intellectual rather than emotional, logic and wisdom fused with divine power. Through Thoth, the Egyptians believed that knowledge itself could protect, heal, and transform. Despite her unusual appearance, a pregnant hippopotamus with lion limbs and a crocodile tail, Taweret was one of the most beloved protective deities in everyday life. She was the protector of pregnant women, newborn babies, and families. Egyptian women wore amulets of her when giving birth, believing that her mighty roar could scare away demons and death. No home was complete without her image carved on furniture, beds, or household objects. The Egyptians knew the truth. Childbirth was dangerous. Life was fragile. Taweret's presence brought comfort, hope, and strength in those vulnerable moments. Among the most charming and surprising gods of Egyptian magic is Bes, the small, lion-faced dwarf god who protected homes from evil spirits and nightmares. Unlike other gods who were depicted in formal, majestic poses, Bes stood out. Wild hair, tongue sticking out, playful yet intimidating expression, always facing forward, ready for confrontation. He was the guardian of the bedroom, infants, musicians, dancers, and everyday joy. Bes chased away demons at night, defended families from curses, and inspired laughter and music. His magic was intimate, personal, and deeply human. To the Egyptians, laughter was a form of protection, and Bes embodied that beautifully. Together, these gods formed Egypt's invisible army, guardians who worked behind the scenes, fighting spiritual battles humans could not see. Through magic, wisdom, ferocity, and protection, they ensured that life thrived, death was navigated, and chaos never fully swallowed the world. In ancient Egypt, magic was not fantasy, it was survival, it was truth, it was divine energy. And these gods were the eternal protectors of that fragile balance. In ancient Egyptian belief, the universe was not a peaceful place. It was a battlefield, a cosmic war zone where two forces clashed without end: Ma'a, the principle of truth, balance, and order, and Isfet, the embodiment of chaos, destruction, and darkness. To the Egyptians, this conflict was not symbolic. It was real, it was continuous, and it shaped everything, from the rise of kings to the movement of the stars. Every sunrise, every heartbeat, every moment of peace was a victory in a war that never truly ended. Ma'a wasn't just a goddess. She was the foundation of reality. Her feather, the feather of truth, symbolized harmony, justice, equilibrium. Without Ma'a, the world would dissolve back into the swirling chaos from which it came. Pharaohs ruled by her authority. Priests recited prayers in her name. And every soul was judged against her feather in the afterlife. For the Egyptians, living in balance wasn't optional, it was a cosmic duty. Ma'a meant the sun rising on time, the Nile flooding with life-giving water, justice in society, peace between gods, and stability in the universe. She was order at its purest form. If Ma'a was the architect of harmony, Isfet was the destroyer, a force older than creation, older than light, older than the gods themselves. Isfet was not a person or a deity you could pray to. It was a force, the embodiment of disorder, darkness, injustice, and destruction. Plague, famine, war, the shattering of moral order or natural law, all of these were the fingerprints of Isfet. To the Egyptians, chaos was not simply bad things happening. It was the unraveling of existence, the return to the void. Every day the universe fought to hold it back. The most iconic expression of this eternal conflict was the nightly confrontation between Ra, the sun god, and Apep, also known as Apophis, the monstrous serpent of chaos. Each day, Ra sailed across the sky in his blazing solar bark. But when night fell, he entered the underworld, stepping into Apep's domain. That's when the war began. Apep wasn't just a snake. He was the living embodiment of cosmic destruction, an endless serpent with hypnotic eyes and a roar that could shake mountains. His only goal? To devour the sun and return the world to darkness. Every night, Apep rose from the watery abyss. He coiled around Ra's bark. He tried to swallow the light of creation whole. And every night, Ra, armed with divine fire and aided by gods like Set, Isis, and Serket, fought him off. Lightning cracked. Cosmic fire erupted. The serpent's body writhed through the darkness. When the sun rose again each morning, Egyptians celebrated. It meant Ra had triumphed. The world had survived one more night. But the victory was temporary, because Apep could never be destroyed, and he would return again the next night, hungrier than before. This endless battle symbolized a core truth of Egyptian cosmology. Order must be fought for, constantly. The cosmic struggle also took place on Earth through the divine drama of Horus and Set, a war that defined kingship itself. When Set murdered his brother Osiris, the world trembled. It was a victory for chaos, a shattering of the natural order. But Horus, the rightful heir, grew under the protection of Isis and vowed to restore balance. Their conflict lasted 80 years in mythic time. Epic battles on land and sea, courtroom trials before the gods, shape-shifting contests, magical duels, and political intrigue. Sometimes Horus won, sometimes Set gained the upper hand. But in the end, Horus triumphed, restoring Maat and taking his place as the divine ruler. This myth shaped every Egyptian king who came after. Each pharaoh was seen as the living Horus, a protector of order, sworn to hold back chaos just as the god once did. The most fascinating part? The Egyptians believed humans were soldiers in this cosmic struggle too. Every act of kindness, justice, honesty, or charity strengthened Maat. Every act of cruelty, greed, or injustice fed Isfet. You didn't need to be a god to influence the balance. Every person mattered. A fair judgment in court supported Maat. A dishonest business deal empowered Isfet. A single ritual, prayer, or offering helped Ra on his nightly journey. A single betrayal or violent act tipped the scales toward chaos. To the Egyptians, the universe wasn't a distant realm governed by distant gods. It was shared. It was participatory. Humans helped keep the darkness at bay. Unlike many ancient cultures that predicted an apocalypse, the Egyptians did not believe the world was destined to end. But they feared something far worse. That chaos could return at any moment. If the king failed, if rituals were neglected, if society fell into corruption or disorder, Maat could crumble, and Isfet would flood back in like a tidal wave. In their eyes, civilization itself was a fragile miracle, one that needed constant protection, vigilance, and devotion. This belief shaped their laws, their rituals, their architecture, their art, and their worldview. Every temple was a fortress of Maat. Every ceremony was a weapon against Isfet. Every pharaoh was a guardian standing between Egypt and oblivion. What makes Egyptian mythology so profound is that it doesn't depict the world as simply good versus evil. Order cannot exist without chaos. Light means nothing without darkness. Creation must always fight destruction. And every day, the battle begins anew. The Egyptians understood a deep truth. The universe is not peaceful. It is balanced, carefully, eternally, and precariously. And that balance must be protected. Their myths weren't just stories. They were reminders that survival requires vigilance, unity, and the courage to face the darkness again and again. Thousands of years have passed since priests walked the halls of Karnak and pharaohs ruled beneath the scorching desert sun. Yet the influence of Egyptian mythology has never faded. In fact, it has grown louder. From pop culture to psychology, from architecture to spirituality, the echoes of Egypt still shape the modern world in ways most people never notice. Let's look at how these ancient gods survived today. Walk into a movie theater, open a comic book, scroll through a fantasy novel. The fingerprints of Egypt are everywhere. Movies like The Mummy, Gods of Egypt, and Moon Knight reimagine Egyptian gods for new generations. Characters like Anubis, Horus, and Bastet appear in video games, Assassin's Creed Origins, Smite, God of War. Even fashion, jewelry, and tattoo art borrow symbols like the Eye of Horus, the Ankh, and the Scarab. The imagery of Egypt, golden temples, black jackal masks, sun discs, cobra crowns, is timeless. It instantly evokes mystery, power, and cosmic meaning. Modern creators didn't invent that feeling. They inherited it. Egyptian mythology deeply influences modern spiritual practices. The concept of the third eye parallels the all-seeing eye of Horus. Life force energy echoes the Ankh, the symbol of breath and vitality. Soul transformation mirrors the journey through the afterlife. Cosmic balance mirrors Maat. Even meditation practices, reincarnation beliefs, and energy healing systems draw inspiration from Egyptian concepts of harmony and spiritual ascension. Walk into any metaphysical shop today. You'll find statues of Isis, Anubis pendants, incense dedicated to Hathor, and books about Egyptian magic that connect ancient rituals to modern self-discovery. The ancient world is not just history. For many people, it is personal. The myths themselves planted seeds in the world of psychology. Carl Jung often referenced Egyptian symbols as archetypes of the human psyche. Osiris as the dying and reborn self. Isis as the archetype of divine nurturing. Set as the shadow, the inner chaos. Horus as the awakened hero, the higher self. Apep as the internal destroyer, the voice of fear. The Egyptian pantheon does not just exist out there. It lives inside every human mind as symbols of emotion, conflict, and transformation. The story of Horus overcoming Set is the story of every person trying to rise above trauma, injustice, or inner darkness. The story of Ra defeating Apep is the daily battle to rise after hardship, doubt, or despair. Egyptian mythology survives because it reflects something universal: the human struggle to find meaning in chaos. Every year, millions of people visit museums around the world just to stand before the statues of Egyptian gods, towering granite figures with serene faces and timeless power. Archaeologists spend their lives uncovering temples, papyri, and tombs not just to learn about the past, but because Egypt shaped the foundations of human civilization. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, law, theology, every new discovery, from a sealed sarcophagus to a forgotten temple beneath the sand, revives the world's fascination all over again. Egypt never truly left. It simply waits beneath the surface, ready to speak when we listen. At the heart of every Egyptian story lies a truth that still feels modern. Life is fragile. Death is a journey, not an ending. Chaos is constant, but order can be restored. We are responsible for the world's balance. In a world full of uncertainty, conflict, and rapid change, the mythology of Egypt reminds us that humanity has faced chaos before, and has always fought its way back to the light. Their myths survive because they are not just stories of gods. They are stories of us. So what can we learn from the Egyptian pantheon today? Why do these gods, some with animal heads, some with wings, some crowned in gold, still captivate the modern mind? Because they represent the eternal questions of human existence. Where did we come from? Why are we here? What happens when we die? How do we find truth, order, and purpose in a chaotic world? The Egyptians didn't run from these questions. They created an entire cosmic system to confront them. Ra taught them that light must be protected. Osiris taught them that death is transformation. Isis taught them the power of devotion and intelligence. Horus taught them courage in the face of injustice. Ma'at taught them to live with integrity, honesty, and balance. Thoth taught them the pursuit of knowledge and wisdom. Hathor taught them joy. Ptah taught them creativity. Anubis taught them that even in death, one is never alone. Their myths remind us that humanity has always been searching for meaning, and that every culture finds it in its own way. Egypt founded in a universe ruled by gods of sun, shadow, creation, and truth. And maybe that is why we still look back at them with awe. Because in these stories, we don't just see ancient temples or old legends. We see reflections of ourselves, our fears, our hopes, our battles, our dreams. The Egyptian gods may belong to the past, but their lessons belong to the present. And as long as humans ask the big questions, as long as we search for purpose, protection, and meaning, the gods of Egypt will continue to live, in books, in movies, in art, in culture, and in the eternal stories we tell.